politics. Long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, presents the U.S. Constitution. The Main Politics Guys is a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. What we're now also bringing you are in-depth series on topics in American politics and policies. Our Politics Guys Presents series will dive deeply, 1 week at a time, into a particular element of U.S. politics. In the Politics Guys Presents the U.S. Constitution, I, Dr. Trey Orndorff, and my co-host, Dr. Ken Katkin, will be diving into the U.S. Constitution, article by article, clause by clause. This multi-year project was originally only for supporters, but is now generally available to you, the listening public. If you like these shows, remember that the Politics Guys are presenting other topics right now to supporters. So head down to the show notes to get access to all of the Politics Guys and now all of the Politics Guys Presents series. In the meantime, I hope you enjoy yourself as you join me and Ken Katkin on our journey through the U.S. Constitution. Well, Ken, this should be an interesting show. I'm doing something I don't normally do. I'm drinking the hard stuff. I'm having a Coke Zero as we speak.
That is the hard stuff, huh?
It is, right? Like, keeps you awake, a little jittery. I don't know. I always kind of picture myself like, there's like that whole meme where he's got everything on the board and he's holding his hands out. I always figure like that's somebody with too much caffeine. I don't know if you get this with your students, but there's that kind of sweet spot before the semester. I don't remember it happening when I was a kid. I guess maybe people were just doing illicit drugs. I don't know. But where they all drink too many Monsters, like there's that, and you're like, where did all of these cans of caffeine come from? They're just everywhere. Does that happen with you guys too? Or is that just an undergrad thing?
My students, they do sometimes like seem jittery and bring in beverages. So yeah, it could be a law student thing too.
Okay. I mean, it's just I always think like let's take the consumption down a little bit here, people. Let's just take it down a little bit. But anyway,
sometimes I try to put in rules that they should stay in their seat and not go to the bathroom. But sometimes they just drink too much of those beverages for that, and they can't stay sitting for an hour.
Yeah. I gave up on that. I'm like, look, if you're going to come in and out, just get up in the back row. Whatever. I'm tired of policing you all. That's the great thing about a podcast, people. You can get up, you can pause it, you can speed it up, you can slow it down, and I don't have to look at it, right? Okay. So, Ken, what we've been working through, and much like what many of my students perceive my classes as, we have slowly been making our way through the Constitution, and we got through Article 1, and then we moved into Article 2 before you left. And last time, we had covered Article 2, Section 2. So as a reminder, Article 1 is Congress. So we were going through all of Congress. And again, if you haven't heard those and you're a supporter, now would be a great time to head back, catch up. This is not late-breaking things. The Constitution isn't going anywhere. You can come through with us. And so then we got to start off on 2, which is dealing with the presidency, which is actually my area of expertise, or one of my areas of expertise as a political scientist. I'm a presidency scholar, particularly. And so we started with Section 1, dealing a lot of stuff with like the vesting clause, but here we're going to be dealing with Article 2. Section 2. And like we've been doing this, we kind of read pieces of it. We talk about it, analyze it a little bit, and we'll read more and we'll see what we're going to kind of get through. But I thought I'd start with just kind of the first paragraph of Section 2, Ken, which begins this way. The president shall be commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy of the United States and of the militia of the several states when called into the actual service of the United States. He may require the opinion in writing of the principal officer in each of the executive departments upon any subject relating to the duties of the respective offices. And he shall have the power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States, except in cases of impeachment. So we get a lot of kind of implied things that start happening, right? So we get this kind of very important power. The president shall be the commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy of the United States and the militia of the several states. And this is something I really talk to students a lot about because, of course, this is a big deal. We're going to have the highest ranking military official be a civilian, right? Not somebody in the military itself. That's a really big deal. Another thing that you might have missed, if you've been coming all the way along with us, you'll notice here he gets this ability to have the writing of the principal officer in each of the executive departments. But of course, there hasn't been any mention of executive departments. What is this, right? Like suddenly we have basically something new. So clearly there's this intention. And one of the possible reads here is, right, the vesting clause vests the president with some powers that are not explicit, or there's some implied things happening here. But we have this explicit mention of executive departments, and they have to do something. They are subservient. They're underneath the president. They have to provide in writing opinions. And we get that. And then, of course, we finish up this first paragraph with another power, and in this case, a power of pardon. And again, kind of reaching this, in this case, forward potentially to things that are going to be happening in Article 3. So, for me, I think the big ones here for the first portion of Section 2, of course, we have a civilian going to be in charge of the Army and Navy. And then, of course, surprise, there's executive departments.
Yeah, I mean, the sort of big takeaway I would take from Article 2, Section 2, Clause 1 is that although it sort of formally mirrors Article 1, Section 8, so in Article 1, Section 8, Congress gets a big list of enumerated powers. In Article 2, Section 2, Clause 1, the president gets a list of enumerated powers. So there's a sort of parallel there. Here's some powers that the president gets vested in him directly by the Constitution. But even though there's that formal mirroring, the first thing that anyone would notice, and you sort of got to it, is once you get past that very first power, which is pretty impressive, being the commander-in-chief of the armed forces of the United States, sounds like a big deal. You immediately get to a short list of very piddly powers, right? Like there's nothing else on there that's much of a power at all. So besides being the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, well, he can make members of his own cabinet answer his questions in writing. All right, I guess that's a power. It doesn't affect us very much, but that's something. He can give pardons. Yeah, I guess that comes in useful at Thanksgiving and Christmas. It's not something like
I think at the time that was obviously a little bit bigger of an ask at that time. There was questions about, would our executive have that similar kind of mimicking to the British monarch, which could intervene in some kinds of trial situations?
Yeah, although I also don't think that they anticipated that there'd be even as many federal crimes as we have. So, I think yeah. So the universe of people who might need a presidential pardon, I think was going to be a pretty rarefied universe of people. That was going to have very limited impact on most Americans who never probably would have been in a position to be convicted of a federal crime and needing a presidential pardon. So I do think those are pretty piddly, pretty minor powers, and they're the only powers that the president gets from Clause 1. He gets a few more from Clause 2, although the ones in Clause 2 are all shared with the Congress. But the unilateral powers from Clause 1, Commander-in-Chief is something, and in fact, not only of the U.S. Armed Forces, but you mentioned the militia clause. He's also the Commander-in-Chief of the militia of the several states, and that would be today we would think of that as the president's power to nationalize and take over control of the National Guards, which are otherwise subject to gubernatorial.
Well, and that actually came up, that portion of the Constitution came up recently as it relates to Oklahoma, when Governor Scott attempted to have a difference in requirements for the Guard in Oklahoma, and it was a court case that actually dealt specifically with that, and no, the president obviously has that power.
Yeah, although only when the Guard is called into actual service. I think in ordinary time, when the Guard is not called into the service of the United States, the president wouldn't be able to exercise that particular power. Although Congress also has some other powers to set rules that govern the militia or the National Guard. But yeah, so we see he's got this big commander-in-chief power. That otherwise, these minor powers. Should we move on to Clause 2 right after that?
Yeah, I think that's important because, right, as you notice, the first clause is dealing with kind of what you might think of as the unilateral powers. That's really not the right word there. But then we're going to get these with the Senate. But before we move into that, we're going to just take a break. Okay, so Ken, let's move into the second clause of Section 2, which says, he shall have the power by and with the advice and consent of the Senate to make treaties, provided 2/3 of the senators present concur. And he shall nominate, and by and with the advice and consent of the Senate, shall appoint ambassadors, other public ministers, counsels, judges of the Supreme Court, and all other officers of the United States, whose appointments are not herein otherwise provided for, and which shall be established by law. But the Congress may by law vest the appointment of such inferior officers as they think proper in the President alone, in the courts of law, or in the heads of departments. And that ends that second clause. Now, a lot of this kind of doesn't really even get codified all the way in until we have the precedent of George Washington early on, right? We have all of this, the advice and consent of the Senate, but what does pragmatically the advice and consent of the Senate mean? And so one of the things to keep in mind is a lot of the execution of Article 2 isn't just in its interpretation, but it's in the early interpretation of the first Congress and the first president and how they decided to do that. And those precedents kind of breathe some additional meaning into those phrases like advice and consent.
Yeah, I mean, I think the distinction between the two types of powers that we just mentioned that are listed here in Article 2, Section 2, Clause 2, the treaty power, which is really a power of foreign relations, and the appointments power, the power to nominate people to serve in the executive branch or as judges. Those two types of powers are shared with Congress in ways that the pardon power or the commander-in-chief power are not. So the president doesn't need to check in with the Senate or with the Congress to give somebody a pardon. He does need to check in with at least the Senate to get a treaty ratified or to get a appointment made to a principal office of the United States. So the treaty stuff, it's largely a dead letter today, I think, really. But I think the framers' idea was that if we were going to have international diplomacy and we were going to reach agreements with foreign countries, that the way that would work would be that the president would negotiate the treaties with the foreign countries, and then he would bring them back to the Senate for ratification. And if you got a 2/3 vote in the Senate, then those treaties would become the domestic law of the United States. But almost every part of that is a dead letter today. Treaties that do get a 2/3 vote of the Senate still don't become a domestic law of the United States now. They have to Congress would still have to pass implementing legislation today, which was something that I think the framers didn't think about very much. And also, Congress can generally rely on its enumerated power to regulate commerce with foreign nations to pass legislation that deals with international subjects, whether or not 2/3 of the Senate has ratified a treaty. So things like NAFTA, which are sort of a big important, we think of it as a treaty, but it was only ever implemented as a statute. Congress enacted the NAFTA statute, but there was never a 2/3 vote to ratify it in the Senate. So I would say that I don't know if you have a different perspective on this, but I think the framers kind of imagined that agreements with other countries would be binding if 2/3 of the Senate ratified them. Whereas in today's practice, treaties with other countries are never, ever, ever binding. Doesn't really make any difference whether 2/3 of the Senate ratifies them or not. But Congress can pass laws through the ordinary lawmaking mechanism of enacting statutes that do deal with topics that affect international relations or foreign affairs.
No, you're not wrong at all. As a matter of fact, I mean, not only do I think you have that go into effect, but then when you put it in conjunction with the supremacy clause, you see not only the idea that we wanted to have them be able to go into effect, but we didn't want the Constitution to be a backdoor way to undo our obligations overseas, right? And so and again, we'll get to this, but the supremacy clause effectively says, look, well, the Constitution and the treaties that we make are going to be the supreme law of the land. Really, I think the only thing that it was a little bit up for debate was, what did they actually mean by the advice and consent? I'm not sure all of the framers thought that we were going to do it in just the manner that you kind of outlined there, the post-Washington manner of, well, I'm going to conduct all of it and then I'm going to bring it back to you and you're going to ratify it. There were obviously some who thought there was going to be some more give or take, but that did not functionally work well in the first Senate.
Right. And for treaties, the number 2/3 is there. So there has to be a vote, and it has to be a 2/3 vote in the Senate. For the appointments power, there's no specific number there. So yeah, I think what they meant by consent might have been a little bit more vague, but it was quickly taken to mean a simple majority vote. The Senate gives consent when it gives a simple majority vote. And so the appointments power, which is very, very dependent on Congress, because all of these positions, it says that the president can appoint with the advice and consent of the Senate, ambassadors, other public ministers and consuls, judges, other officers, but none of those jobs exist unless the Congress passes statutes that create those jobs. So the Constitution doesn't guarantee that there's going to be any ambassadors or any public ministers and consuls, or I guess it does guarantee that there will be judges of the Supreme Court, but it doesn't guarantee that there'll be any other officers of the United States. So Congress has to pass statutes deciding what jobs there are going to be in the executive branch and in the judicial branch. And then for those jobs within those branches that would be considered officers of the United States, the president can nominate people. And then, as we would now understand it, with a majority vote in the Senate can confirm those people.
Okay, so Ken, you were telling us, the different kinds of the appointment powers that we have, and that variation there for when the president gets to vote versus, gets to appoint, and the push on Congress to do. Now, this has actually been, unlike the treaty power, which, like we said, look, that's kind of wrapped up. The remainder of paragraph 2 and appointments, that continues to be an issue. I mean, even into end of the aughts, we continue to have Supreme Court cases dealing with the president's power. I mean, one of the items here that we hadn't gotten to yet is, the text itself talks about the appointment, but what about if the president wants to remove somebody? What about removing somebody, say, for something like good cause? And that leads to cases like Humphrey's Executors versus the United States in 1935. So what about some of those powers here that we're seeing when it comes to the appointment?
Yeah, in fact, that's what Andrew Johnson got impeached over, the issue of removal. So that came up even before the Humphrey's Executor case.
Yeah.
So before I get to remove, I do want to talk about removal. But one last thing I think we didn't quite mention before we get to removal, the other thing that the text provides for, because you're right, it doesn't talk enough about removal, but it does distinguish between the appointments process for principal officers of the United States.
We didn't talk about this is important. Continue.
And for inferior officers of the United States. So whereas every principal officer of the United States, it's required by the Constitution that for someone to become a principal officer, they have to be nominated by the president and confirmed by the Senate. But there is a sort of a escape hatch for all of the other federal jobs. The framers didn't want it to be that every single federal employee had to be nominated by the president and confirmed by the Senate. Even then, when we had a much smaller government than now, they understood that that would take a lot of time and effort, and the Senate would probably never be doing anything but voting on presidential nominations to every single job. So there's a sort of exception there that says for inferior offices of the United States, Congress may by law vest the appointment as Congress thinks proper in any of three choices. Could be vested in the president alone, could be vested in the courts of law, could be vested in the heads of departments. So right now, today, for instance, there's a lot of White House jobs like the White House Chief of Staff or the White House Counsel, and Congress has vested those.
And that's something worth you say that. I'm not sure everybody's going to know what you're talking about, right? So one of the things to keep in mind is, there are different blocks of the executive, and one is the executive office of the president, and inside of the executive office of the president is the office of the White House, right? And that's what you're talking about here. So talk to us about that, Ken.
Yeah, so substantially everybody who works in the White House and in the executive office of the president is considered an inferior officer of the United States. And so typically, Congress has already passed a law that says the president can appoint people to that job who he wants, and they don't have to come back for a Senate confirmation hearing. And that's permissible as long as they're inferior officers. Now, pretty much for heads of departments, any if you think of the departments that Congress has created, like the Justice Department or the Department of Defense or the State Department or the Treasury Department, all of those secretaries who head up those departments are going to be principal officers, so they have to be nominated by the president, confirmed by the Senate, and we typically do see Senate confirmation hearings for those kinds of offices. But it's also the case, for instance, in the Justice Department. The Justice Department employs thousands of lawyers. The Defense Department, is a very large department. It probably employs tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of military personnel. And all of those appointments can be vested in the heads of departments. So it can just simply be left to the Secretary of Defense to hire people to work in the Pentagon, or to the Attorney General, or even the U.S. attorneys in particular districts to hire like the entry level federal prosecutors or military low-level military officers or things like that. So Congress can do all that. So there's this idea that Congress gets to decide with respect to inferior officers exactly where the hiring authority should lie. But for principal officers, there's only one method of hiring authority, and that is nomination by the president, confirmation by the Senate. And there have been.
And doesn't that even get I mean, I don't want to get too deep down the rabbit hole, but there's even a little bit of a potential distinction there, because you have Buckley versus Valeo, where you have this question of, well, who even is an officer versus, say, an employee, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think in Buckley, it's interesting. I don't know if anybody argued that the federal election commissioners were merely employees, but I think there was an argument that they were inferior officers, but the Supreme Court rejected that. So the listeners might want to know about that case. So yeah, so the Buckley versus Vallejo case, which you just mentioned, Trey, that dealt with it was a 1976 case. It dealt with the Federal Election Campaign Act of 1974, and that act was a post-Watergate reform. So, because of the fact that some contributions that ordinary donors had made to the committee to reelect President Nixon had been used by that campaign to pay the burglars who broke into the Watergate Hotel and wiretapped the Democratic National Committee. It was thought that it would be a good idea to have a federal agency that kind of tracks and makes more transparent the donations that come into campaigns and the expenditures that go out of campaigns. And so the Federal Election Commission was created. But when Congress was creating that commission, there was a concern in Congress that since the president himself is often a partisan who's involved in elections, sometimes is actually running for reelection, or is always a member of one party, that it wouldn't be good to let the federal elections power be concentrated under the president, because there was this risk that there'd be unequal enforcement, that the presidents would just use that power as a real sword against the opposing party, and they would never really come after members of their own party for any violations. So when Congress set up the Federal Election Commission, they actually said that there would be 5 commissioners, and they gave different ways that the different commissioners would be appointed. And I don't remember it exactly, but I think the president would get to appoint 1 or 2 of them. The Speaker of the House would get to appoint 1. The president pro tempore of the Senate would get to appoint 1. I can't remember who would appoint the other. But
yeah, there was a number of different locations.
Yeah. And so you'd wind up with 5 commissioners, but they weren't all the president's appointees. And then they would take votes to take actions. And the Supreme Court did strike that down in Buckley versus Valeo as unconstitutional. And the court held that because the federal election commissioners were heads of an agency, that necessarily meant that they were principal officers of the United States. So they were in charge of a branch of the United States government or an agency of the United States government, and so they therefore could only be appointed through nomination by the president and confirmation by the Senate. There couldn't be any other alternative route to appointing any of the commissioners. Now, after that, the court did sustain some restrictions on who the president could nominate. So, for instance, for the Federal Election Commission today, and also for the Federal Communications Commission, there's statutes that say, well, the president nominates everybody who's on those commissions, and they all have to be confirmed by the Senate, but there can never be more than a simple majority who are members of the same political party. So on the 5-member commissions, no more than 3 commissioners can be members of the president's party. And the president still gets to decide who to appoint, but he's limited only to appointing a couple of commissioners who are not a member of his political party. And that kind of restriction is permissible as long as it's the president that does get to decide who to nominate. His choice set of who he can nominate from can be limited.
Yeah, and that's an important point, that it can be limited but not dictated or removed by Congress.
Yeah, Congress can't just make the appointments, which is what they were going to do for at least a couple of the federal election commissioners. But Congress can pass a statute that says when the president nominates people to be on the Federal Election Commission or the Federal Communications Commission, he can nominate whoever he wants, but no more than 3 out of 5 of the commissioners at any time can be members of his political party. So if he's already got too many, he can choose someone from a different political party to nominate.
So now,
and that kind of I'm sorry.
No, it's all I was going to say. So what now then about the side of that's not really dealt with, just the implication of the federal removal of officers, right? You know, the Supreme Court has held that Congress may not condition the removal of a federal official on Senate advice and consent. How does that work through? Yeah.
Yeah, so the Constitution doesn't say anything about removal.
No,
and this was this is a very contested issue for a big chunk of American history. So I mentioned a little earlier, and I'll explain it a little more now. It is the reason Andrew Johnson was impeached. So what happened when after Lincoln was assassinated was Andrew Johnson became president because Lincoln was assassinated, but he really shouldn't have been. And Lincoln, as kind of a symbolic thing to show that to show national unity and to show that he was trying to reunify the country. He was a Northern Republican and he wanted to pick a Southern Democrat to be his running mate. So Andrew Johnson was a Tennessee Democrat. Tennessee was in secession at that time, but he became the vice president. And then when Lincoln was assassinated, he became the president. Well, the day that happened, it was clear to all of Lincoln's sitting cabinet that they were not going to get along with Andrew Johnson. They wanted a strong military reconstruction of the South. A military occupation that would completely reinvent the Southern institutions. And Johnson just wanted a really quick return to the pre-war status quo. He didn't want a military occupation of the South. He didn't want the federal government reforming Southern state political institutions. And so they knew they were going to be fired. That once Johnson became president, he was going to get rid of Lincoln's cabinet. So what they did preemptively was they got their friends in Congress. And remember, this is a time in Congress when the states that had seceded had all walked out of Congress. And
so you have a lot more ability to pass things.
Yeah. So they passed a statute called the Tenure of Office Act. And the Tenure of Office Act says any officer who got their office through being nominated by the president and having their nomination confirmed by the Senate, they can't be removed without the consent of the Senate. So if they got confirmed by the Senate to get in, then a removal would also have to be confirmed by the Senate. And,
I'm going to pause you just for a second, Ken, because I'm actually going to make a little bit of a recommendation if people are curious about this. I think this story is such a good one, and sometimes it's hard for individuals to understand, well, why were the individuals around Lincoln so put together on this front? And that's because you actually had a bunch of potential presidential candidates who was actually a part of Lincoln's executive branch. And as a matter of fact, if you want to read more about this, Doris Goodwin has a really excellent book called Team of Rivals that chronicles him putting that together. But anyway, yeah, continue.
Yeah, I think that's right. But I also think it's not just that they were all presidential candidates. It's that they all agreed with each other that they really wanted a strong military reconstruction of the South. And they did not want any of the people who had been Confederates.
But they hadn't always, though. And them getting to that point is, I think, partly an interesting story. But anyway, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
yeah. And they also wanted to keep their jobs in the administration. They didn't want to be fired. And Johnson was going to fire them all. And
Yes.
so Johnson took the position that the tenure of office, he vetoed it, but they overruled his veto very easily. And so the Tenure of Office Act got codified as law because a 2/3 vote in the House and in the Senate can override a presidential veto. And then he just violated it, and he fired Secretary of War Stanton in violation of the Tenure of Office Act, and he claimed that he had the constitutional authority to remove any member of his cabinet. And he based that. We haven't gotten to Article 2, Section 3 yet, and we won't until next podcast. But there is a requirement, and there's an obligation in Article 2, Section 3 that the president is responsible to make sure that the laws are faithfully executed.
It is the
And
very last phrase. It says, just for those interested, he shall take care that the laws faithfully executed and shall commission all the officers of the United States. And that's the key. Continue.
Yeah, so he argued that in order for the president to make sure that the laws are faithfully executed, it's necessary that the president be able to remove a member of his cabinet who's failing to faithfully execute the laws, because otherwise he wouldn't be able to ensure that the laws were faithfully executed. So that was his constitutional argument for why he had a removal authority as a matter of constitutional right, even though he was now violating the Tenure of Office Act, which was a statute that said that he didn't have that removal authority. So he was impeached over that, and that was the high crime and misdemeanor, was the violation of the Tenure of Office Act, and he skated through by one vote. It takes a 2/3 vote for removal, and Johnson came much closer than Trump to actually getting removed. Trump was safe by about 9 or 10 votes, but Johnson was only safe by one vote.
Well, one of the interesting, I think, what ifs of history is the difference in the American fabric had he been removed. Not just, even put aside the differences at the time for him, but just legally speaking, had we been willing to cross the threshold of removing a presidency, that would have lowered, I think, the barrier in many people's minds for the ability to impeach. And impeachment might have been a more used, or at least not as unused item of constitutional law. But it doesn't, and one vote makes a big difference.
Yeah, it's hard to know about that because the political conditions were unique. At that time, you could get that many votes because you had that much of a disparity, a party disparity in who was in the Senate. But you always need a 2/3 vote to remove. It's been relatively unusual in American history that you could have a partisan impeachment, because there hasn't. You need very unusual political conditions for a president to get elected from one party and more than 2/3 of the senators to get elected from the other party. But that happened during the Civil War because the Southern states walked out of the Senate.
It's a weird circumstance. I don't think most people recognize how weird. In large part, had the South, in response to Lincoln, simply opposed him politically, especially in the Senate, it is unlikely that Lincoln would be the character that we think of him today, in large part because he would not have gotten anything done, and he was not particularly inclined to do, some of the large items that he did. They were incidental to holding the Union together. And so, had the South not seceded, the Senate would remain in Democratic hands. Lincoln would probably not have been able to do even the few political things he wanted to do, and certainly would not have done things like the Emancipation Proclamation, because that was not part of his original end goal.
That's absolutely right. I think his presidency would have looked more like Biden's today, really.
Yeah.
He would have an agenda in kind of stark opposition to the opposition party, but and he'd probably get a few things done, but none of the big things that he did get done for sure.
He
So
would be like one
I
of
don't.
those, that middle schoolers forget as they're trying to remember, for winning points. I don't know. Does anybody do
Yeah.
that anymore? Does anybody have to still memorize all the presidents? Maybe not. I don't know. Anyway, continue, Ken. Continue.
I don't want to get so far afield from the removal, but I just wanted to mention removal was actually the central issue of the
Yes.
one of the handful of presidential impeachments that we've had. The Supreme Court came around 50 years later to addressing the same question. It was actually under the same Tenure of Office Act, which was still on the books 50 years later. And the case was Myers versus United States. And in Myers versus United States in the 1920s, the court sided with the Andrew Johnson position and said that because the president has the responsibility to take care that the laws are faithfully executed, the president has to have removal authority to remove executive officers who are failing to faithfully execute the laws. And so Congress can't interfere with that. Now, there ended up being a series of 20th century cases that muddied those waters a little bit. You mentioned the Humphreys
Yes.
executor
One of the big ones
case
in
earlier.
35.
Yeah, I think that's essentially overruled by the Morrison case, but maybe so the Humphreys executor case it contemplated the concept that we have sort of a fourth branch of government in some of the so-called independent agencies, and that those are not purely executive agencies, and so the president doesn't have to have removal authority. But I think I would say that's basically a dead letter because I think the key post Humphreys case is the Morrison versus Olson case that involved the special prosecutor, the independent counsel, during the Reagan era, and that's the same office that became Ken Starr's office later during the Clinton era. And so the question in Morrison versus Olson was Congress had passed a statute. Actually, it was an amendment to the Ethics in Government Act, and it said that under certain conditions, if there were certain allegations that high-ranking executive officials, including the president or people close to the president, had committed crimes, and there was a certain modicum of evidence, that the judges in the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit should appoint an independent counsel who would be housed in the Justice Department and who would have all the authority of Justice Department prosecutors to conduct investigations and prosecutions, but who wouldn't be answerable to the Attorney General or the President, but would only be answerable to the judges of the D.C. Circuit, and that he would therefore be able to go ahead and do investigations and prosecutions and couldn't be fired because he's getting too close. And so in Morrison versus Olson, the court addressed, well, does that violate the principle from Myers that the president has to have unilateral removal authority over everybody in the executive branch, or at least over everybody who's exercising core executive powers? And everybody agreed that federal prosecutors were exercising core executive powers. So in Morrison, I think the court largely repudiated the Humphreys case and the distinction between sort of core executive branches and quasi-independent branches. And the court said it's all the executive branch, so we need a rule that works for the whole executive branch. But what the court said is that although the president does have to be allowed to remove people who aren't faithfully executing the laws, it is permissible for Congress to impose good cause requirements, that although the president absolutely has to have the unilateral authority to fire an executive official who is failing to faithfully execute the laws, who's not getting the job done, it doesn't follow from that the president also has to be allowed to fire executive officials who are doing a good job and are faithfully executing the laws and are getting the job done. And so the court said it's okay for Congress to impose a good cause restriction and say that the president can't fire unless there's good cause. Now, that way, if the president can show in a court proceeding that the person he's firing deserved to be fired, then the president has to have unilateral authority to fire. But if the president's trying to fire for bad reasons, if you've got a president who's the target of a special counsel investigation and the prosecutor's doing a good job and the president wants to fire him because he's getting too close, well, that would be the president that's trying to not faithfully execute the laws. That wouldn't be the independent counsel that's trying to not faithfully execute the laws. And so the court in Morrison versus Olson says, those kind of good cause restrictions can be imposed. So that, I think, is the state of where we are now on removal authority.
Now, isn't there just one teeny little piece left there? I mean, in 2010, don't we have the Free Enterprise Fund versus the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, where you had the question over, well, what if you're an inferior being removed? And so if you're not directly to the president, then the direct appointment has the unilateral ability to remove you.
I don't remember that case being about removal. I remember it being about appointments, but I don't. It's not in my immediate recall. But I thought that case was about appointments and about whether there could be administrative law judges could be appointed by a
recess.
No, not a recess. By other administrative law judges. In other words, not by the president and not by the head of the department, right? I think that's what that case was about, and you'll have to forgive me if I'm wrong about that because you're springing on me. But I thought
sorry.
I thought the FASB case was about how low can the appointment authority be vested? So if someone's a principal officer, the appointment authority is with the president. If someone's an inferior officer, the appointment authority can be with the heads of departments.
But I'm pretty sure so is the removal. I think that was the other piece of that. In other words, the removal rests then with that next officer.
Okay, I'll have to trust you on that. I just don't remember that case well enough to,
And again, so anyway. Well, now we still have one little piece left of Section 2, which is the last. Section 2 is the third clause, which is the president shall have the power to fill up all vacancies that may happen during recess of the Senate by granting commissions which shall expire at the end of their next session. And now this is not as big of a deal today, although it still comes up. But, there were large periods of time where you have long recesses, and this gives the president the ability to kind of have temporary appointments. Now, this also gets complicated when, I'm forgetting what year it is now, Ken, when Congress for a while, although it was found unconstitutional, had those pro forma sessions, right? Where they, somebody would show up and, or, hey, who's all here? Nobody's here. Well, that's the end of the day's business, right? We can't, we don't have a quorum. And they would move on. And wasn't that?
No, but that wasn't found unconstitutional. That was actually sustained. The case you're thinking of is the Noel Canning case.
I thought that was eventually over. I thought during the Obama era that was ended.
No, the court mostly sided with the Congress on that. It was a little bit of a split decision, but it was during the Obama era. And the case is called Noel Canning. It was
Noel Canning. Okay, thank you.
2014 case. And I use both names, Noel and Canning, because that's not a person's name. That's literally the name of a company that did canning. So the Noel Canning, the Noel Canning Company canned stuff into cans. And so they got in some trouble with the National Labor Relations Board about their labor practices. And at that point in time, the McConnell had basically been blocking Obama's ability to appoint anybody to the National Labor Relations Board. And the National Labor Relations Board is supposed to be a board with 5 board members. And it had dwindled down to 2, which wasn't even a quorum to do business. They needed to have at least 3 to have a quorum. And so there really wasn't a National Labor Relations Board anymore. And so Obama made 3 recess appointments. So he put three commissioners on there using the recess appointment power. And so you read the language of it. The president has the power to fill up the vacancies that may happen during recess of the Senate by granting commissions which shall expire at the end of the next session. So if there's a recess and if a recess appointment can be made, then that means that the consent of the Senate isn't needed for that. But it also means that the recess appointment expires at the end of the next congressional session. It's not an open-ended term of office. And so in Noel Canning, when the Obama made these 3 recess appointments, and then you had 5 commissioners again, two of whom had been properly appointed and three of whom were recess appointees. Uh, they made a ruling against the Noel Canning Company in their labor dispute, and Noel Canning took it to the Supreme Court and said that the ruling should be voided because the NLRB only had two commissioners. That wasn't enough to do business, and the other three weren't legitimately appointed. And so, in that case, the Supreme Court had to address itself to a couple questions. One was, when is the recess, and one was this issue that you mentioned about the pro forma sessions. And the court largely said that most of the time, a pro forma session is a valid way that the Senate can prevent the president from making recess appointments. So they actually did side with the Senate on that, but they said if it lasts more than a certain number of days, and again, I didn't. I just got back from France. I didn't reread the case.
And we're not holding it against you, Ken, right?
It was something like 10 or 12 days. It was something like 10 or 12 days. So I think there became a certain point where if a pro forma session lasted long enough, then the court would say that the president could treat it as a recess. But if it was a typical shorter one, then as long as they gavelled it in, as long as somebody came in and gavelled it in, that wasn't going to count as a recess. So it is actually very common to this day. You won't see it right now because the Senate and the White House are in the same hands, both in hands of Democrats. But if you had the White House in the hands of one party and the Senate in the hands of the other party, it would still be very common to see the Senate holding a pro forma session where somebody comes in and all the senators are told we're only going to be holding pro forma sessions. No legislation is going to be voted on. You don't actually have to show up. But then the majority party will make sure that somebody shows up every day and bangs the gavel and says, we're in session today. Does anybody here have any business for the Senate? And there'll be nobody there anyhow, so nobody will have any business for the Senate. And then they'll say, okay, since no one has any business for the Senate today, we'll meet again tomorrow. And that kind of thing can work to some extent to defeat recess appointments. So I think the other issue, as I'm remembering it, that the court decided Noel Canning was for there to be a recess appointment, does the vacancy have to happen during the recess, or is it okay for there to be a vacancy that was already around? And now that the Senate then subsequently goes into recess, can the president make a recess appointment? And the court did side with the president on that issue, and they said if there's something that counts as a recess, then he can make a recess appointment, even if the vacancy was already there before the recess.
Yeah, I remember that part. Okay. Well, Ken, we
these
made
are
it
very
through.
technical. I hope these are interesting to the listeners. These are pretty technical sections of the Constitution.
But it's exciting. I mean, again, I don't know. I mean, if you unless you want the technical stuff, but where else are you going to get the technical stuff besides with us, right? Like, where else are we going to be like, I'm not sure we quite got the interpretation perfect, because we haven't read it as deeply. So no, I think that's kind of an important thing. That's what we do. I think that's part of what's fun about doing doing the bonus show with you. But this is where we're going to have to pause next time. We're going to take on Article 2, Section 3. Yeah.
Can I say one other thing that just occurred to me?
Sure.
One significant thing about recess appointments in history, there was a window in time when you still had, enough senators who would never have agreed to confirm an African American to be a judge, and who would have filibustered any African American nominees to be judge. That it is actually the case that in most of the judicial circuits, most of the circuit courts in the country, the first African American judges on those circuits were recess appointees to the judiciary. And that's very unusual. You don't usually see recess appointments to the judiciary because people generally, for judiciary, you want someone that's going to have the life tenure. You don't want to appoint someone who's only going to get to serve for a year and then their recess appointment's going to expire. But that was a way to break the color barrier in most of the circuit courts in the country, was just to put that African-American judge on there, which the president could do unilaterally as a recess appointment. And then there would have been an African-American judge on the court. And sometimes that made it a little bit easier to get those judges confirmed by the Senate after they were already on the court than it would have been if they hadn't already been on the court.
Yeah, no, that kind of racism continues. I think it's easy to forget how recent that blatant level of racism was even possible in the United States. You know, we oftentimes think of that being a long time ago, but it's not.
Yeah, this is the 60s, 70s,
Yeah.
and even into the 80s we're talking about here, so not super long ago.
I'm trying to think of the last one. Would have that been in the 80s? That been the last one? I was thinking it was like 70 something, but
No,
late
I think
70s.
I think it is possible even Clinton did that. I think as late as the early 90s, Clinton made a recess appointment to the federal judiciary for
race.
an African American judge. Yeah, and then I think he renominated the same guy once he was already on the court, which really made it harder for people who wanted to oppose him to come up with reasons they were opposing him. You know, if his performance on the court didn't give them reasons to
Okay.
oppose.
Man, I
Yeah.
just don't remember. I'm sure you're right. That was not one that I was remembering off the top of my head. So yeah, again, I didn't. We don't have everything for everybody anyway. But well, yeah, I appreciate it. If you've listened this far to the show and have been following along with us, I'm encouraged. It means that you're a supporter and you're really interested in this stuff, like Ken and myself are too. And I hope that you've enjoyed us going through that. One of the things I'm going to encourage everybody. Don't forget, if you aren't already on Discord, that's a really great place. We've got a whole channel on Discord for the shows and for questions. So if you guys have questions, and I had been thinking about it this week, if you have questions about what's going on, that'd be a really great way to ask them and say, hey, you guys were covering, removal. That was pretty technical, guys. I have a little question about that. That'd be a really great place to kind of put those questions. And then if we have enough of them or we have things dealing with the show, we could come back and we could address them in kind of those Constitution question shows as well. So please make sure that you put those questions in there. But again, just thank you so much for being a supporter. It's what gets you access to this and it gets you access to so many other things. I do once again want to plug, though, if you are at the $10 level or higher, that means you're going to be available for our second ever. We're going to be continuing to do these. These are listener participation segments where you get a Zoom link. You get to be part of what's happening while it happens. Mike and Jay did this last week. They're going to be doing another one on the 17th at 9 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. So that means you still have time. So if you're listening to this right now, you're a supporter, but maybe you want to bump that contribution up just a little bit, 50 cents a dollar, so you can get to that $10 level, because that seems to be a really cool go. And right now, that's what Mike and Jay are doing. And they'll be doing that with Zoom. And I think in some points in the future, possibly Ken and I will be getting involved in those. But for right now, the next one coming up, our second ever, is the 17th at 9 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time for those at the $10 or higher level per month. Now, wherever you are, though, I want to thank you so much for being a part of the show. And if you want to get in there and change your level of support, don't forget you can head to patreon.com/politicsguys to do that so that you can make sure you're at that $10 level or higher. You can always, of course, support the show in different ways, like on Venmo, we're at politicsguys. Again, look at the show notes and or take a look at politicsguys.com/support. For those additional ways to make that happen. Again, I hope you really enjoyed this midweek show. If you've got any kind of comment, question, or gripe, don't forget you've got Discord there. I'd love to talk to you on Discord. I know that Mike and I are both active there, and we'd love to have those questions. But of course, you can always reach out and mail@politicsguys.com, or you can check out the show notes for Facebook and Twitter. The executive producers of The Politics Guys are Bruce Johnson, Wilma Moreno, Andra Masker, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, Don Oglesby, and Ivan English. We'll be back with a new episode in just a few days. I hope you'll join us then.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.